Dave May 3rd, 2013. Hey, I'm here to try to explain what I'm going to do for a test on your parts. I thought it'd be easier if I gave you a quick video rather than try to explain it in a email. So that's my attempt here. So what we have is we have our part, which is the nut body and the lock ring. And then we have a bunch of sample parts which were received from your office in Australia. So I have grade 8 nuts and grade 8 bolts, 8.8 and 10.9 bolts, and plus we have the E-bar. I'm going to show you a little bit of what I'm doing. The two tests we want to do is check the prevailing torque of the lock nut on the bolt, and then we're also going to check the clamp load under different torque conditions. So we'll be sending it out for a lab for that. Now, first of all, I want to show you what we start with is I want to know what my starting point is, so I measure the pitch diameter of the bolt, because that's really important. The pitch diameter of the bolt is important for getting the right prevailing torque. So we have pitch diameter gauges for the bolts. We're using these to measure the pitch diameter and verify that they're within tolerance. And I'll explain a little bit why it's important that the bolt's within tolerance when we talk about some details on the lock ring. So the lock ring, as most of you know, is an oval shape, and the oval shape gets expanded out when the bolt goes through it, and it creates force on the bolt. So it's important. The oval shape doesn't expand a lot. It only expands maybe anywhere from 5 to 15 thousandths. So it's very little. It's a small amount. Now the tolerance on the thread is typically no more than about 7 thousandths on this size bolt. So we've got some fairly tight tolerances we have to hit, and so we want to see how we're doing with that. So we start out with all of them, and I'm going to show you when we get out in the shop how we check all of them. We're checking them all with the pitch diameter gauge, and then we're also verifying it on our comparator to make sure that the results are right. So we check the pitch diameter, and then to kind of give you an illustration of what happens, we have the lock ring. When it starts out, it's an oval. It's an oval shape, and then it gets put into the nut body. So we've got the nut body here, and when it gets put in the nut body has a circular cutout in it, and the lock ring gets assembled into here. And to do that, we're compressing the lock ring in this direction. So the ovals, this is the long direction of the oval and the short direction. And then once it's sitting in the nut body, let's draw it over here in the nut body. I'll draw another illustration. Sneak around this way. So we have the round in the nut body. And then the oval will sit in here, and it'll still be oval, but it'll be compressed along the long direction. So it'll sit in there. So it's very important now what the size of this oval is when it's in the nut body. So we'll measure the distance across the outside of the part, right here. And I want to know how far that expands once the bolt goes through. So I measure it before it's in there, and then we put the bolt through the part, and then we'll measure this dimension right here after the bolt's in there. Now, ideally, like I said, it needs to move like 5 to 15 thousandths to create the right clamping force. You can see as if this is too round, then it won't create enough clamping force, or if the bolt's too small, it'll have a similar problem. So we have so that's what we have going on, and we're going to check those torque values out in the shop, and I'm going to probably move from there, and we'll talk about what we're going to do in the shop. Yeah, something else I thought of before we head to the shop, I wanted to explain. This is the nut right here, if you can zoom in close on that, right? This is the nut typically that we make, and this was received, I marked the ones with the J on it, the one received from Australia. So I have some of those, and I have some more recent ones that we produce in the shop. You'll notice that the insert is typically flush to the surface. What we do here is when I'm doing the test is I'll push the insert up a little bit, and you'll see that in the test, and the reason for that is so I can measure the dimensions before the bolt goes through and then after the bolt goes through. So you'll see that with the insert. That doesn't affect the prevailing torque though. But one of the things that we talked about before is we had made some changes recently from the parts that you probably have in Australia right now to the parts we're currently making. Is we opened up the counter bore, which is the diameter, this diameter right here. We open up the counter bore slightly, and what that allows it to do is when we put the ring in here, when the ring sits in it, it makes the small dimension smaller, the small side of the oval smaller, and it allows it to expand more when the bolt goes through. So opening up this to a higher tolerance, to the high side of the tolerance, created more torque. So I'm going to show you some of the results and the difference between the existing parts that you have in Australia and the ones that we're currently making now. Okay. Here we're in the shop. It's a little noisy around here, so I tried to do the explanation in the office to start with. If you take a look, we've got some sample parts here on the table. I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit, right? This is the part we received from the guys in Australia. We have the E-bar, plus I have a variety of different bolts. And the bolts vary. Some of the bolts are 10.9, and some of the bolts are 8.8. So we have different types of bolts. I think I have 2 8.8s and 4 10.9s. Plus I have some bolts that we have in stock within our own stock that we use for testing. So then I have the nuts that we received from your current batch here in Australia, and I have some nuts that we've made here most recently. So I'm trying these on. All these bolts are going to have nuts installed on them, different combinations of existing nuts, new nuts, and all that. So I've measured and recorded all the pitch diameters on the bolts, and then we're getting ready to install them. So I've already gone through all these tests and I've got the results. I'm going to step through real quick kind of what I do. One of the things I'll mention about this piece right here is I've noticed when we take the pitch diameter reading on the E-bar, I initially took the measurement across a particular area, and I noticed as I moved it, when I was installing the bolt, the lock, that it went from easier to harder as it went on. And then I remeasured and noticed that the pitch diameter changes by as much as 5 thousandths as I move around the outside of the part. And that tells me that the shape of this is slightly oval. So it should to the tune of about 5 thousandths. That's one thing we can check down there. And we re-verify this from a comparator. We have a comparator where we can check the accuracy on that also. It's a little slower, and I can verify a few of these to make sure we're getting the right numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a quick installation of the part. So we take a part like this. Part the device, we spin it on. Spin it down until it's on the lock. Tighten it down. So a few threads. So about 1 or 2 threads are sticking through the part. We have a torque measuring gauge. This is the gauge that will measure the peak torque value as I install the nut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it into a full turn and measure the peak, go forward and backwards. So we'll turn it this way, 1 full turn. Take the torque value, so the torque value is 300 inch-pounds on this one. And then we'll advance it so we get the counterclockwise torque. Again, we have 300 inch-pounds coming off the backside. This is kind of ironic. Usually it's not exactly, but it turned out that way on this one. So that's what we're measuring. Now what I'll do is I'll spin the part all the way off and spin it down again and try it for a second time. Because sometimes you get little stuff on the threads and you get a little bit higher torque reading on the initial installation. So I usually take the second installation as a